Tantor Audio, a division of Recorded Books, presents The Last Crusade, The Epic Voyages of Vasco da Gama, by Nigel Cliff, narrated by Perkins. Prologue. The light was fading when the three strange ships appeared off the coast of India, but the fishermen on the shore could still make out their shapes. The two biggest were fat-bellied as whales, with bulging sides that swept up to support sturdy wooden towers in the bows and stern. The wooden hulls were weathered a streaky grey, and long iron guns poked over the sides, like the barbels on a monstrous catfish. Huge square sails billowed toward the darkening sky, each vaster than the last, and each surmounted by a bonnet-shaped topsail that made the whole rig resemble a family of ghostly giants. There was something at once thrillingly modern and hulkingly primeval about these alien arrivals, but for sure nothing like them had been seen before. The alarm was raised on the beach, and groups of men dragged four long, narrow boats into the water. As they rowed closer, they could see that great crimson crosses were emblazoned on every stretch of canvas. "What nation are you from?" the Indians' leader shouted when they were under the side of the nearest ship. "We are from Portugal," one of the sailors called back. Both spoke in Arabic, the language of international trade. The visitors, though, had the advantage over their hosts. The Indians had never heard of Portugal, a sliver of a country on the far western fringe of Europe. The Portuguese certainly knew about India, and to reach it they had embarked on the longest and most dangerous voyage known to history. The year was 1498. 10 months earlier the little fleet had set sail from Lisbon, the Portuguese capital, on a mission to change the world. The 170 men on board carried instructions to open a sea route from Europe to Asia, to unlock the age-old secrets of the spice trade, and to locate a long-lost Christian king who ruled over a magical eastern realm. Behind that catalogue of improbability lay a truly apocalyptic agenda: to link up with the Eastern Christians, deal a crushing blow to the power of Islam, and prepare the way for the conquest of Jerusalem, the holiest city in the world. Even that was not the ultimate end, but if they succeeded it would be the beginning of the end, the clarion call for the second coming and the last judgment that would surely follow. Time would tell whether this quest for the promised land would end at anything more than a castle in the air. For now, bare survival was uppermost in the crew's minds. The men who had signed up to sail off the edge of the known world were an odd assortment. Among them were hardened adventurers, chivalric knights, African slaves, bookish scribes, and convicts working off their sentences. Already they had rubbed uncomfortably close against each other for 317 days. As they swept in a great arc around the Atlantic, they had seen nothing but the bounding main for months on end. When they finally reached the southern tip of Africa, they had been shot at, ambushed, and boarded in the dead of night. They had run out of food and water, and they had been ravaged by mystifying diseases. They had wrestled with heavy currents and storms that battered their ships and tattered their sails. They were assured they were doing God's work, and that in return their sins would be wiped clean. Yet even the most seasoned mariner's skin crawled with morbid superstitions and forebodings of doom. Death, they knew, was just a swollen gum or an unseen reef away, and death was not the worst conceivable fate. As they slept under unknown stars and plunged into uncharted waters that map-makers enlivened with toothy sea monsters, it was not their lives they feared to lose, but their very souls. To the watching Indians, the newcomers, with their long, filthy hair and their bronzed, unwashed faces, looked like the rougher species of sea-dog. Their scruples were soon overcome when they found they could sell the strangers cucumbers and coconuts at handsome prices, and the next day the four boats returned to lead the fleet into port. It was a moment to make the most stoic seaman stand and gape. For Christians, the East was the wellspring of the world. The Bible was its history book, Jerusalem, its capital of faith, suspended between heaven and earth, and the Garden of Eden, which was firmly believed to be flowering somewhere in Asia, its fount of marvels. Its palaces were reportedly roofed with gold, while fireproof salamanders, self-immolating phoenixes, and solitary unicorns roamed its forests. Precious stones floated down its rivers, and rare spices that cured any ailment dropped from its trees. People with dogs' heads ambled by, while others hopped past on their single leg or sat down and used their single giant foot as a sunshade. Diamonds littered its gorges, where they were guarded by snakes and could be retrieved only by vultures. Mortal dangers lurked everywhere, which put the glittering treasures all the more tantalizingly out of reach. At least so they said. No one knew for sure. For centuries, Islam had all but blocked Europe's access to the East. For centuries, a heady mix of rumour and fable had swirled in place of sober fact. Many had died to discover the truth, and now the moment was suddenly at hand. The mighty port of Calicut, an international emporium bursting with oriental riches, the hub of the busiest trade network in the world, sprawled in front of the sailors' eyes. There was no rush to be the first ashore. The anticipation, or the apprehension, was too much. In the end, the task was given to one of the men who had been taken on board to do the dangerous work. The first European to sail all the way to India and step on its shores was a convicted criminal. The men in the boats took him straight to the house of two Muslim merchants from North Africa, the westernmost place they knew. The merchants came from the ancient port city of Tunis, and, to the visitor's surprise, they were fluent in both Spanish and Italian. "The devil take you! What brought you here?" one of the two exclaimed in Spanish. The convict drew himself up. "We have come," he grandly replied, "in search of Christians and spices." On board his flagship, Vasco da Gama waited impatiently for news. The Portuguese commander was of medium height, with a strong, stocky build and a florid, angular face that looked as if it were welded from plates of copper. By birth he was a gentleman of the court, though his beetling brow, beak nose, cruelly sensuous mouth, and bushy beard made him look more like a pirate leader. He was just 28 when he was entrusted with his nation's hopes and dreams, and, though he had been a surprise choice, his men had already learned to respect his boldness and mettle and to fear his flaring temper. As he surveyed his floating realm, his large, sharp eyes missed nothing. Keen ambition, matched by an iron will, had brought him through dangers and across distances that no one had conquered before, but he was well aware that his great gamble had just begun. The question that motivated this book tugged at me several years before the story began to take shape. Like most of us, I was bewildered by the eruption of religious war into our everyday lives, and as I found out more, I realized we were being drawn back into an ancient conflict about which we had developed collective amnesia. Reason, we believed, ruled the world in place of religion. War was about ideology and economies and ego, not about faith. We were caught taking a nap from history. The march of progress is a tale victors tell themselves. The vanquished have a longer memory. In the words of modern-day Islamists, who see their struggle not as one to come to terms with the West, but to defeat the West, the rot set in half a millennium ago. That was when the last Muslim emirate was expunged from Western Europe, when Christopher Columbus landed in the Americas, and when Vasco da Gama arrived in the East. Those three events unfolded in one dramatic decade, and their intimately entwined roots reach deep into our common past. 7 centuries before that pivotal decade, Muslim conquerors had marched deep into Europe. In its far west, on the Iberian Peninsula, they had founded an advanced Islamic state, and that state had played a vital role in lighting Europe out of the Dark Ages. Yet, as Christians and Muslims alike began to forget that the God they worshipped in their different ways was one and the same deity, the fires of holy war were lit in Iberia. They burned fiercely as the Portuguese and Spanish carved their nations out of Islam's lands, and they were still burning when the Portuguese embarked on a century-long mission to pursue their former masters halfway around the globe, a mission that launched Europe's Age of Discovery. The timing was no coincidence. For hundreds of years, history had marched from east to west, and on the eve of the Age of Discovery its drumbeat was getting faster. In the middle years of the 15th century, Europe's greatest city had fallen to Islam, and Muslim soldiers were once again preparing to advance into the heart of the continent. At a time when no one suspected that new continents lay waiting to be found, Christendom's hopes of salvation were pinned on reaching the East. In Europeans' frustrated fantasies, Asia had become a magical realm where an alliance against the enemy could be forged, and the dream of a universal church could finally be fulfilled. Tiny Portugal had set itself a truly audacious task: to outflank Islam by making itself the master of the oceans. As the collective effort of generations built toward Vasco da Gama's first voyage, the Spanish scrambled to join the race. Since they had a deal of ground to make up, they decided to take a chance on an Italian maverick named Christopher Columbus. In 1498, as Vasco da Gama sailed east into the Indian Ocean, Columbus sailed west for the third time and finally reached the mainland of the Americas. Both explorers were searching for the same prize, a sea route to Asia. Yet Vasco da Gama's achievement has long been overshadowed by Columbus's magnificent mistake. Now that we are returning to the world as it was in their time, a world where all roads lead east, we can finally reset the balance. Vasco da Gama's voyages were the breakthrough in a centuries-old Christian campaign to upend Islam's dominance of the world. They dramatically changed relations between East and West, and they drew a dividing line between the eras of Muslim and Christian ascendancy, what we in the West call the medieval and the modern ages. They were not, of course, the whole story, but they were a much bigger part of it than we choose to remember. The Age of Discovery used to be glorified as a quixotic quest to push the boundaries of human knowledge. These days, it tends to be explained as a drive to reverse the global balance of trade. It was both. It transformed Europe's sense of its place in the world, and it set in motion a global shift of power that is still unravelling today. Yet it was not just a new departure. It was a deliberate attempt to settle an ancient score. Vasco da Gama and his men were born in a world polarized by faith, where fighting the infidel was the highest calling of a man of honor. As the blood-red crosses on their sails broadcast far and wide, they were embarked on a new holy war. They were told they were the direct successors to 4 centuries of crusaders, knightly pilgrims who had swung their swords in the name of Christ. They were charged with launching a sweeping counter-offensive against Islam and inaugurating a new era, an era in which the faith and values of Europe would be exported far across the earth. That, above all, was why a few dozen men in a few wooden tubs sailed off the edge of the known world and into the modern age. To understand the passions that drove Europeans into distant seas and that shaped our world, we need to go back to the beginning. The story starts among the wind-carved sand dunes and scorched mountain ranges of Arabia, with the birth of a new religion that swept with breathtaking speed into the heart of Europe itself. Part 1. Origins. Chapter 1. East and West. When Muhammad ibn Abdullah first heard the word of God, in or around the year 610, he had no intention of founding a world empire. He was not even sure he was sane. "Wrap me up," the 40-year-old merchant said, shivering miserably as he crawled up to his wife, who threw a cloak around him and held him, stroking his hair as he wept. He had been meditating in his usual cave outside Mecca, a luxury afforded him by marriage to a rich widow 15 years his senior, when the angel Gabriel appeared, threw him into a painful, ecstatic trance, and spoke to him the words of God. Muhammad was terrified that he was going mad, and contemplated throwing himself off the mountain. But the voice kept coming back, and 3 years later Muhammad began to preach in public. Gradually the message emerged. The faith of Abraham and Jesus was the true faith, but it had become corrupted. There was one God, and he demanded Islam, complete surrender. This was bad news for the rulers of Mecca, who had grown fat on religious tourism to the city's 360 shrines. Mecca had sprung up around a palmy oasis in the Hijaz, the baked barrier of mountains that stretches along the Red Sea coast of the Arabian Peninsula. Its authority radiated from the Kaaba, the square, squat sanctuary at its centre that housed the Arabs' chief idols. Every year hordes of pilgrims emerged from the desert, descended on the holy precinct, and circled the stone cube 7 times, straining to kiss each corner before the press of bodies pushed them back into the whirl. Over time, one tribe, the Quraysh, had orchestrated their guardianship of the Kaaba into a stranglehold on Mecca's commercial lifeblood, and at first Muhammad's revelations were aimed squarely at them. The greedy Quraysh, he accused, had severed the egalitarian threads of Arab society. They had exploited the weak, enslaved the poor, and neglected their duty to care for the needy and oppressed. God had taken note, and they would all go to hell. What infuriated the Quraysh was not so much Muhammad's talk of the one merciful God, or even his claim to be God's mouthpiece. To the north, a kingdom of Christian Arabs had existed for centuries, and in the Kaaba itself the figures of Jesus and Mary stood proud among the idols. Jewish migrants to Arabia had been influential for even longer. The Arabs considered themselves the Jews' fellow descendants of Abraham through his firstborn son Ishmael, and many identified their high god with the God of the Jews. In Muhammad's time, poet-preachers perpetually roamed the deserts, exhorting their tribesmen to renounce idolatry and return to the pure monotheism of their forefathers. Nothing could be less controversial. What was uniquely intolerable was that Muhammad was an insider. His family clan, the Hashemites, was a minor branch of the Quraysh. He was a respected businessman and a small but solid pillar of the community, and he had turned on his own kind. The Quraysh tried everything, from bribes to boycotts, to discredit the troublesome preacher, and finally they turned their hand to midnight assassination. Just in time, Muhammad slipped out of the house, evaded the blade, and fled to a distant oasis settlement that would become known as Medina, the city of the Prophet. There, as his following grew, he implemented the radically new society he had only dreamed of in Mecca, an ummah, or community of equals, united not by birth but by allegiance, bound by laws that gave unprecedented rights to women and redistributed wealth to the neediest. As the revelations continued, he began to believe that God had chosen him not just to deliver a warning to his tribe, but to be a messenger to humanity. For his message to spread, he first had to reckon with Mecca. 8 years of ferocious wars with the Quraysh blooded the establishment of Islam. At the darkest hour, his face smashed up and smeared with blood, Muhammad was dragged from the battlefield by one of his warriors, and only the rumour that he was dead saved the remnants of his army. The Ummah's morale was crushed, and it was about then that Muhammad made his fighters a promise that would echo through history. The slain in battle, it was revealed to him, would be swept up to the highest level of paradise. They shall be lodged in peace together, amid gardens and fountains, arrayed in rich silks and fine brocade. We shall wed them to dark-eyed houris. The Muslims, those who submit, clung on, and, clinging on against the odds itself, seemed a sign of divine favour. The decisive moment was not a battlefield victory, but a spectacular public relations coup. In the year 628, Muhammad unexpectedly appeared before Mecca with 1,000 unarmed pilgrims, and asserted his lawful right as an Arab to worship at the Kaaba. As he solemnly performed the rituals, while the Quraysh stood sullenly by, the rulers of Mecca suddenly looked more foolish than invincible, and opposition began to crumble. In 630, Muhammad returned with massed ranks of followers. He once again circled the sanctuary 7 times, intoning Allahu Akbar, God is great, then climbed inside, carried out the idols, and smashed them to pieces on the ground. By the time he died, 2 years later, Muhammad had pulled off a feat that no other leader in history had even envisaged. He had founded a flourishing new faith and an expanding new state, the one inseparable from the other. In a little more than a year, the armies of Islam crushed the Arab tribes that held out against the new order, and for the first time in history, the Arabian Peninsula was united under one ruler and one faith. Driven by religious zeal, a new-found common purpose, and the happy alternatives of vast spoils in life or eternal bliss in death, God's newly chosen people looked outward. What they saw were 2 superpowers that had been doing their utmost to obliterate each other from the face of the earth. For more than a millennium, East and West had faced off across the river Euphrates in Mesopotamia, the fertile land long known as the cradle of civilization and today home to Iraq. On the eastern side was the illustrious Persian Empire, the guardian of an ancient, refined culture and of the world's first revealed religion, the monotheistic faith of the visionary priest Zarathustra, a faith known after his Latinized name Zoroaster as Zoroastrianism, that told of creation, resurrection, salvation, apocalypse, heaven and hell, and a saviour born to a young virgin centuries before the birth of Christ. Led by their great Shahanshahs, kings of kings, the Persians had been the inveterate foes of the Greeks until Alexander the Great had smashed their armies. When Persia's power revived, it had simply transferred its hostility to the Greeks' successors, the Romans. The ancient struggle was the formative East-West clash, and in 610, just as Muhammad was receiving his first revelations, it had finally exploded into total war. As waves of barbarians ran riot around Western Europe, the Emperor Constantine had built a new Rome on Europe's eastern brink. Glittering Constantinople looked out across the Bosphorus, a strategic sliver of water that leads from the Black Sea toward the Mediterranean, at Asia. Ensconced behind the city's impregnable walls, Constantine's successors watched helplessly as the Persians swept across their rich eastern provinces and headed toward Holy Jerusalem. Long ago the Romans had razed Jewish Jerusalem to the ground, and a new Christian city had risen over the sites identified with Jesus' passion. Constantine, the first Christian emperor, had himself built the Church of the Holy Sepulchre over the purported places of Jesus' crucifixion, burial, and resurrection. Now, to Christian anguish bordering on the apocalyptic, the Persians carted away the true cross on which Jesus was believed to have died, along with the holy sponge and lance and the city's patriarch, and left the Holy Sepulchre smouldering and hollowed out against a blackened sky. On the brink of oblivion, the Romans struggled back and emerged triumphant, and Persia imploded into civil war. But the victors, too, were exhausted. Roman cities had been laid waste and were overwhelmed by refugees. Agriculture had been blighted and trade had ground to a halt, and everyone was heartily sick of the crushing taxes that had paid for imperial deliverance. In a time of churning Christian controversy, most damaging of all was Constantinople's remorseless drive to enforce its orthodox version of Christianity across its lands. Having first fed Christians to the lions, the Romans had turned to persecuting anyone who refused to toe the official line, and across a large swath of the eastern Mediterranean, from Armenia in the north to Egypt in the south, Christian dissidents were far from unhappy at the prospect of a new regime. With breathtaking bravado, the Arabs attacked both ancient empires at once. In 636, 11 centuries of Persian might ended in a bellowing elephant charge near the future site of Baghdad. Damn this world, damn this time, damn this fate, Iran's national epic would rue, that uncivilized Arabs have come to make me Muslim. Islam's path opened north to Armenia, northeast to the Asian steppes bordering China, southeast to Afghanistan, and onward to India. That same year, an Arab army crushed a vastly larger Roman force at the Battle of Yarmouk and annexed Syria, where Saul of Tarsus had been converted on the road to Damascus and where, in Antioch, he had founded the first organized Christian church. The next year, Jerusalem was starved into submission and opened its gates to the new set of conquerors, just 8 years after the Romans had triumphantly restored the true cross to its rightful place. The faith-torn city was holy to Islam, as well as to Judaism and Christianity, and centuries of struggles between Romans and Jews over the sacred places gave way to centuries of clashes between Muslims and Christians. 4 years later, fertile, gilded Egypt, the richest of all Roman provinces, fell to the Arabs. While Constantinople stood impotently by, the truculent desert tribesmen it disparagingly labelled Saracens, the tent people, had taken all the lands it had so recently reconquered at such great cost. As kingdoms and empires were humbled and fell, even bishops began to wonder if Muhammad had been commanded from on high. From Egypt, the armies of Islam marched west across the Mediterranean shores of Africa, and there, quite unexpectedly, their seemingly unstoppable onrush stalled. The trouble was partly domestic. Muhammad had died without naming an heir, or even leaving clear instructions about how a successor should be chosen. Ancient rivalries soon resurfaced, sharpened by the booty of conquest that snaked in endless caravans across the deserts and invariably ended up in the pockets of the Quraysh, the very tribe whose monopolistic greed Muhammad had so roundly attacked. After some tribal jockeying, the first 4 caliphs, successors to the Prophet, were selected from among Muhammad's close companions and family, but even that high status failed to protect them. An irate Persian soldier thrust a dagger into the second caliph's belly, gutted him, and knifed him in the back while he was at prayer. A cabal of Muslim soldiers, incensed at the third caliph's lavish lifestyle and blatant nepotism, bludgeoned him to death, and the Ummah erupted into civil war. Ali, the 4th caliph, the Prophet's cousin, son-in-law, and closest confidant, was stabbed with a poisoned sword on the steps of a mosque for being too willing to negotiate with his fellow Muslims. His followers, who had always maintained that Ali was Muhammad's divinely anointed successor, eventually came together as the Shia to Ali, the party of Ali, or Shia for short, and split irrevocably from the pragmatist majority who became known, after the term for the path shown by the Prophet, as Sunnis. Out of the turmoil, the first caliphal dynasty emerged, in the form of the Umayyads, who moved the capital away from the snake pit of Arabia and ruled for nearly a century from ancient cosmopolitan Damascus. Yet opposition continued to plague the young empire, this time from outside. In North Africa, the Arab armies were bogged down for decades by ragged hordes of blue-eyed Berbers, the ancient indigenous peoples of the region. The Berbers had rampaged down from their mountain redoubts every time previous waves of conquerors had paid them a visit, and they were not inclined to adapt their behavior merely because they professed themselves converts to the new faith. At the head of the Berber charge was a fearsome Jewish warrior queen known to the Arabs as Kahina, or the prophetess, who galloped into battle with her fiery red curls streaming out behind and drove the invaders far back east, until she was finally hunted down by a vast Arab army and died fighting, sword in hand. As the 8th century dawned, the Berbers' revolts petered out, and many swelled the ranks of their vanquishers. In little more than the span of a single lifetime, the armies unloosed by Mohammed had swept an unbroken crescent around the Mediterranean basin, all the way to the shores of the Atlantic Ocean. From there they gazed on Europe. With staggering speed, the world had turned full circle.
Sample complete. Ready to continue?